Thank you, Ibn Warraq. Our next speaker is the author of the international bestseller, The Trouble with Islam Today. She is the prime mover of a grassroots movement called Project Ijtihad for reform within Islam. And her new documentary on PBS, Faith Without Fear, debuts on Thursday, April 19th, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please join me in welcoming Irshad Manji.
Well, good morning, everybody. Salaam alaikum. Shalom. And to the atheists out there, how the hell are you? I know there are a few, and I'm cool with that. As a Canadian, let me add, je suis très fier d'être ici avec vous. Ibn Warraq gave his rationale for why he does what he does. Here's mine. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the recognition that some things are more important than fear. And much more important than fear, to me, is reconciling faith and freedom. That idea is actually quite compatible with a beautiful verse from the Quran, a verse that I actually wear around my neck today. Chapter 4, verse 135, which states, believers, conduct yourselves with justice and bear true witness before God, and here's the kicker, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your family. That's a call to heed my conscience, no matter who's offended. I came to this secular Islam summit from Detroit just a couple of nights ago, where I was holding the first public screening of my forthcoming PBS documentary, Faith Without Fear. And at the screening, I was asked by another Muslim whether I believe that secularism and Islam can be reconciled. And my answer was an unequivocal yes. You see, for all that the Quran tells us about various human rights issues, from slavery to women's equality to religious pluralism, the one issue related to human rights on which the Quran is pretty well silent is, what is the proper form of Islamic government? It has virtually nothing to say on this issue. Now, I say to Muslims that if you believe that the Quran is divinely authored, or at the very least, as I believe it is divinely inspired, then surely this silence is deliberate, which means that we as Muslims have the room to experiment with different forms of government. And that includes secularism. But then I went on to say to the Muslim who asked me this question, why secularism at all? Here's why. As a Muslim pluralist, I honor the breathtaking diversity of God's creation, diversity of ideas, of expression, of opinions, and not just the superficial diversity of appearance. Secularism makes room for varied ideas, including different religions and philosophies. The opposite of secularism, theocracy, makes no room at all for differences. Somebody please inform George W. Bush that freedom for the people of Iraq cannot be achieved by empowering the theocrats, as his administration sadly has done, by privileging Sharia law in Iraq's new constitution. Nor, I would argue, is this approach respectful of Islam itself, since the Quran contains 3 times as many verses calling on Muslims to think, reflect, and analyze than verses that tell us what is absolutely right or wrong. In other words, yes, Islam can be compatible with freedom of conscience. The key, I believe, is to expect more of Muslims themselves. How ironic that George W. Bush today exemplifies a phrase that he once used to slam his critics, namely, the soft bigotry of low expectations. Now, maybe it's because I believe Muslims are capable of better than theocracy that I remain a person of faith, and proudly so. But that does not make me a person of dogma. Faith is secure enough to handle doubt. Faith never needs to be threatened by doubt. Dogma, on the other hand, always is threatened by doubt. And dogmatists, let's face it, folks, can be found in all creeds. Among them, atheism. The most furious letters I receive come from Orthodox Muslims on the one hand, and what I would call missionary atheists on the other. Not atheists in general, just like not Muslims in general, missionary atheists. Those who despise religion with such a seething rage that they mimic the very religious fundamentalism they claim to oppose. Missionary atheists angrily instruct me to ditch the myth of God and embrace the one and only arbiter of truth, science. Sounds a lot like fundamentalism to me. To say that something is a fairy tale unless you can see, touch, taste, or measure it is rather like saying it didn't happen if it didn't appear in the New York Times, the self-appointed arbiter of all the news that's fit to print. Just because this summit won't be covered by network news programs doesn't mean this summit didn't take place. Truth is, having religion keeps me curious, full of doubt about every belief, including, yes, secular ideas. Religion has furnished me with values such as discipline and empathy that compete with the greed and selfishness of material life. And it's this tension between a religious lifestyle and a secular lifestyle that compels me to keep questioning and avoid any fundamentalism of my own, be it feminist, nationalist, or multiculturalist fundamentalism. Religion has taught me to bow to no one but the God that dwells restlessly in my conscience. And that, I believe, is a precious skill to have in an age when we're relentlessly marketed to. Above all, through religion, I've learned not to confuse authority with authoritarianism. Authority can be legitimate. Authoritarianism, which is the abuse of authority, is never acceptable. And that is indeed what people like Ibn Waraq and I can certainly agree on. The bottom line is this: religion is a lot like technology. Each can be used in whatever way we choose. We can become slaves to each, or we can harness each for the highest ideals of our shared humanity. Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, the Dalai Lama, they and many others attest to the potential of using religion for good. And in that spirit, a group of young Muslims and I are using the best of Islam, a tradition of creativity known as ijtihad, to promote critical thinking in Islam. Our campaign, Project Ijtihad, draws inspiration from the towering intellectual, scientific, and artistic figures of Islamic history, figures such as Ibn Rushd, whose philosophies built upon the works of Aristotle, Rumi, whose poetry championed an Islam that welcomed all, including those who choose to disbelieve. The Mughal emperor, Akbar, who sponsored open debates, independent reasoning, scientific exploration, artistic dissent. Muslims once had these freedoms, and there is no reason, save for pure politics, we cannot have them again. Indeed, I would argue we must have them again if Islamic practice is to be updated for the 21st century. And that is why this spring, Project Ijtihad will be launching a website that hosts taboo-busting debates within and about Islam. Our goal? To develop the world's most inclusive network of reform-minded Muslims. I'm happy to report, ladies and gentlemen, that this network is already expanding. Project Ijtihad's first campaign will revolve around a young, seasoned terrorist who's been transformed into an ardent and fierce defender of democracy. For security reasons, I can't give you his name right now, though in a few short weeks I will be able to, but let's call him Hamza for the time being. The quick story about Hamza is this. I met him unexpectedly in early July of last year as I was in London, England, to commemorate the first anniversary of the 7/7/2 bombings. I met Hamza, as I say, rather surprisingly. And he told me that he is 26 years old and that he had been an active member of the UK terror network for 7 years. During that time, he himself developed doubts about the theological legitimacy of what he was being asked to participate in. His conscience instructed him to quietly distance himself from the network, which he did, quietly. And one night, he received an unsolicited knock on his door from his still best friend in the network, who said to him, "Hamza, we know you're desperate. You're isolated. You have no one to turn to. You've sacrificed a lucrative means of making a living. You've given up on your family of the last 7 years. You have no identity anymore. We know this. And that's why I'm here to offer you a chance to return. Come back to the fold and stick with us, and all will be forgiven." Hamza tells me that he was severely tempted that night to do exactly that, living in emotional as well as financial poverty. But he also prayed for inspiration. Having finished his morning prayers and with nothing better to do, he went to his computer and surfed and stumbled across something he didn't even know existed, which was the Islam page of the BBC website. And on that page, he came across an interview that I had given to the BBC. For lack of anything better to do and cursing me as he was downloading the interview, he listened. And he said he was reminded by the interview of 2 key points. First, that it is entirely permissible within Islam to ask questions. And second, that he is not alone in asking those questions. And he said that morning he made the commitment to leave the terror network for good. And what we are doing at Project Ijtihad, when we launch our debate-driven website, is first and foremost, we will promote the idea of an open source Islam so that both Muslims and non-Muslims can come to the site and ask Hamza any question they wish about what drove him to do what he did, what was the theological basis that he used to justify it, what is the theological basis he uses to now justify having left it? And how can he and I reach more people like him? All questions are on the table. And having asked those questions and created something of a discussion that has never existed before in real time, we will then bank on the premise that this will outrage existing young jihadis to the point where they will actually want to engage in debate with Hamza, because they will want to crush him theologically. And at that point, we will then sponsor real-time debates with the jihadis themselves and see whether in fact there is room within Islam to engage in dialogue and reflection rather than retaliation. We jihadists will be called every name in the book. For conservative Muslims, we'll be too radical. For conservative atheists, we'll be too traditional. In fact, we are radical traditionalists. Traditional in advocating ijtihad and the revival of it, and radical in wanting it to be not merely revived, but also democratized, so that all people know of their right and their God-given responsibility to ask questions. This is not a call for the legalistic practice of ijtihad to be popularized. Let me be very, very clear that the legalistic practice of ijtihad requires a great deal of knowledge and study and academic and theological training. So mine is not a call for the legalistic practice of ijtihad to be popularized. Rather, it is a call for the spirit of ijtihad to be broadened beyond the academics and the jurists. Anything less is a dangerous form of elitism that cements a pattern of submissiveness among contemporary Muslims. A submissiveness that stops even moderate Muslims, never mind those of us who are reform-minded, stops even moderate Muslims from speaking up as extremists take over, because they are conditioned by a pattern of submissiveness to authority. Authority that then can be abused to become authoritarianism. Ingrid Mattson, president of the Islamic Society of North America, would appear to agree with this analysis. Listen to what she has said about mainstream Muslims today, and I quote, "Because of our very narrow vision, our legalistic vision, and our authoritarian models of decision-making, we are excluding those people who can offer us a different vision for the future." Unquote. She goes as far as to encourage ijtihad among comics, poets, and musicians. Now, if Professor Mattson has the courage of her convictions, and I would hope and pray she does, then she and the Islamic Society of North America will support Project Ijtihad, because its message echoes hers, that before we can know who is worth listening to, we must let a wide spectrum of Muslims find their voices. But reform-minded Muslims are fighting conservatism, not just in the Muslim community. We're also fighting conservatism in the general public. And let me explain what I mean by conservatism. For reform-minded Muslims to succeed, non-Muslims must also be encouraged to exercise independent thinking. This is the conservatism I'm about to refer to. I cannot begin to tell you how many open-minded, broad-hearted people of all religions and none approach me to say, "Irshad, I would love to support your campaign to reconcile Islam with freedom of conscience. But you realize that if I do, I'll be called a racist for sticking my nose in other people's business." To them, I respond, it's only other people's business if you believe that human rights are not universal. If you believe human rights are universal, and you realize you are a part of this universe, then it's your business too. I know very well that that's not enough of an answer, because while it makes logical sense, it doesn't lift the emotional sting of being unfairly labeled a racist. So we need to give progressive non-Muslims the tools with which to confront the political ploys that shut down discussion. And in my view, the best tools with which to open up discussion are bold, blunt questions. I say this to the non-Muslims in the audience today. The next time someone calls you a racist for raising concerns about repression in the name of Islam, ask them, why are you racially profiling me? That's essentially what you're doing. On the basis of my white skin or my non-Muslim heritage, you are telling me that I have no place in this most public of public conversations. You are reducing me to my demographics rather than elevating me to the shared values of our common humanity. That is racial profiling. And if that's unacceptable to do to Muslims, and it is, why is that cool to do to non-Muslims? Ask them that question. Now, having taken them aback by challenging their authoritarianism, I suggest you push the parameters a little bit more by asking them the next question. Do you realize the logical and moral implications of the argument that you've just given me, that we cannot comment if we do not represent? The implication is that we civilians cannot challenge the torture at Abu Ghraib or at Guantanamo Bay because, hey, we are not of military culture. So how can we possibly understand what the soldiers have gone through? We have no right to challenge it. That's the implication of this argument. And another implication is that Muslims in Europe and Muslims in the Islamic world cannot challenge American politicians who come up with U.S. foreign policy because, hey, those Muslims are not of American culture. So how can they possibly understand what American politicians are going through? Now I ask you this, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you this. Would your detractors accept such an argument? Of course not. Nor should you accept such an argument when it's hurled against your right to ask questions out loud. And finally, having really pissed off your detractors, let's just go for broke, shall we? Ask them at least one final question. Do you realize that in the last 100 years alone, more Muslims have been raped, imprisoned, maimed, tortured, and murdered at the hands of other Muslims than at the hands of any foreign imperial power? This is not me denying Western colonialism. I was born in Uganda, a country colonized by the British. I know Western colonialism up front and personally. What I'm saying is, as a proponent of diversity, I have to acknowledge that colonialism comes in many shades and many skin tones. And that includes Islamist imperialism against other Muslims. Muslims are the first victims of Islamist violence. So that when you stand up for freedom of conscience in Islam, the people you are first and foremost defending are ordinary Muslims themselves. What's racist about that? Go ahead and ask those questions out loud. But the reality is that most of us are not doing so. Instead, here's what I see happening today. Those of us who refuse to censor ourselves because we have faith in Muslims to be able to handle challenges with maturity. Those of us who refuse to censor ourselves because of our faith in Muslims, we are accused of being Muslim haters. But those who censor themselves because they have little or no faith in Muslims and expect only barbarism from them, well, such people are congratulated for having respect for Muslims. How does that work? This is not only absurd, this is dangerous. Losing the nerve to express yourself freely is a sure way to create, in public opinion, the belief that Muslims are just too different from non-Muslims, so that coexistence is futile. In other words, under the banner of a misguided notion of respect, we will be cultivating the very chasm in values that we assume we're avoiding, as has already taken place in Europe. Opinion shapers here in America can prevent that despair by showing the public that there are reform-minded Muslims and in investing us with the legitimacy to represent various interpretations of Islam. And let me tell you where something like this has actually worked. Some of you may know that in my own country of Canada, last year, a major debate took place about whether to introduce Sharia law for Muslim families in civil cases of family disputes and divorce and custody and violence and so forth. What happened was a small group of Muslims, not all of them men, I would add, approached the government of Canada's largest province, Ontario, and said, "We have religious freedom in this country, don't we? Well, our religious freedom must include the choice to practice Sharia law in certain cases." Now, I'm all for choice. I'm a feminist, but let's face it, when Muslim women who are new to the country, as most Muslim women in Canada still are given the so-called choice of Sharia law, it isn't presented to them as a choice. It's presented to them as an obligation. As the leader of the group that went to the Ontario government made it very clear when he said those who do not follow Sharia law are apostates. So we're not really talking choices here at all. But the Ontario government, bedazzled by a 21st century notion of multiculturalism, swallowed this pill and actively considered introducing Sharia law. And it did so secretly, considering this proposal. Well, what happened was, when the news broke to the media that this proposal was being considered seriously, the very first people to hit the streets in protest were none other than Muslim women. Some dressed in hijab, some not. Some who considered themselves eminently secular, others who considered themselves very religious. But Muslim women were the first to insist that we do not need Sharia law in Canada, not because we oppose Islam, God knows, and not because we oppose the Quran, but because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is Canada's constitution, is broad enough to cover everybody's rights. Why balkanize it further by unnecessarily introducing religion into the public sphere? That was the argument made in press conferences, in hearings, in demonstrations by Muslim women. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, those in positions of authority didn't care, didn't take notice. One Saturday, a group of high-profile non-Muslim women had an open letter to the Premier of Ontario published in Canada's major national newspaper, the Globe and Mail. And they asked the Premier to defeat this proposal. The very next day, a Sunday, the government of Ontario announced that Sharia law was off the table. Here's what I suspect happened. When Muslim women alone were making this argument, it was only intra-community politics. Nothing for the government to get involved in. But when non-Muslim women made this argument, suddenly the frame widened, and it became an issue of defending secularism. A secular, open society that allows all people to practice their faith profoundly, personally, and privately. That was the stakes. Now think about it this way. Whenever feminists fight violence against women, we know we need the support of decent men. Well, now that reform-minded Muslims are fighting violence against open societies, we know we need the support of good and decent infidels. And that must include devout atheists. So I want to wrap up. I say this with affection, of course. I want to wrap up by reading you a statement written by a core member of Project Ijtihad. His name is Akbar. That is, in fact, his real name. A young Muslim in India. Here's what he wrote just a few days ago. I will not shrink from the fight against Islamic fanaticism. I live in a secular democratic country where I have the freedom to practice my faith, Islam. I value being a Muslim because it gives me a moral framework to live my life by. While I find this framework given by my religion to be the most appropriate for me, I know that my fellow citizens and fellow human beings find other religions or philosophies more appropriate frameworks for their lives. I am indebted to my country's democracy, he goes on, however imperfect it may be, in letting me choose the faith that I practice. I also value the opportunity afforded in my society to disagree, debate, and befriend people whose views are different from mine. I would be a poorer person had I not been born in such a country. Akbar then says, and to whom much is given, much is expected. Today, he writes, our relatively free, increasingly multicultural societies are under threat, first and foremost by Muslim extremists who have declared their intent to bring about a global Islamic caliphate. Theirs is a hateful and misogynist philosophy financed by oil-rich dictators. That it twists my beloved faith to justify a simplistic ideology gives it a powerful allure for Muslims who haven't had the exposure to varied ideas and strains within Islam. Akbar then says, we Muslims living in free societies need to be in the forefront of this fight. We fight not only for the security and integrity of the societies we live in, but also for the soul of our faith. Only we can present an alternate interpretation which promotes the vision of peace, progress, and equality that Islam can enrich. And so Akbar asks, let us make our faith, our countries, and ourselves a promise today. We will not sit silent when someone uses our religion to legitimize bigotry, misogyny, or violence. We will counter it loudly. We will not be bullied by the self-appointed guardians of our faith who say the Islam they know is more pure than the various Islams we know. Muslims define Islam, and we are all its guardians. And we will defend our democratic societies despite some people in them who suspect our loyalties and doubt our motives because of our faith. Our faith and our countries need us today, he says. We cannot, we dare not shrink from the fight. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, that Akbar invokes the statement, to whom much is given, much is expected. He invokes a religious principle to resist religious fanaticism. This summit cannot and should not be used to alienate people of faith, like Akbar and like me. He is on our side. The question is, how can we ensure that he knows we are on his side. Thank you very much.